things.
But what do you think about like where to draw, like the question of where to draw the line with having memorials or statues of these people, whether they, let's say they did something good, right? Like
Thomas Jefferson.
Like Thomas Jefferson, right? But at the same time, they also had this dark side where they were slave owners. Or,
Well, I'm going to primarily address the question of Civil War Confederate statues, right? Because, Confederates were literally rebels. I mean, they were enemies of the United States, right? So that puts them in a different camp from George Washington and Thomas Jefferson, who were the founders of the United States, right? All slaveholders, but one were, traitors who were betraying the United States, and others were not. So I'm going to focus on the Civil War stuff. To me, it's what really shapes that whole debate is that those statues came up at a particular moment. Like, to me, it matters that they came up in 1895, 1910, like this turn of the century moment, that they did not go up right after the Civil War. So it's like at this moment when when history is being weaponized and militarized to protect white supremacy, which is like why those statues came up in the 1890s at that moment, because they wanted to solidify white control and white power. Because they come around at that precise moment, we have to think about them very differently than if they came around in 1865 or something, like during the Civil War. So because those statues were deeply political at the moment that they were built, that they were trying to broadcast a message, and in fact, black people at the time wrote about this. Like, they were very aware of this. Like, when those statues start popping up in the 1890s and 1900s, they knew, I mean, I have quotes, that I've found, black people saying, well, it's really just white people talking to us about Jim Crow with those statues, right? They're trying to send a message of, hey, white supremacy is the system that defines the South. So given what those statues were trying to do at the particular moment, like 30, 40 years after the Civil War, it's not just about that. That suddenly means what we're debating is not just about the Civil War. We're actually debating the 1890s and 1900s. And that's a much easier conversation in some ways to have, because it makes them just look so unequivocally nasty, right? These statues. Same with the Confederate battle flag, right? Like, when we talk about the Confederate battle flag, we're not just talking about the Civil War. Yeah, we're talking about the 1890s, like when Florida puts that on its flag. But we're also talking about the 1950s and 1960s, when that symbol gets pulled in again on the behalf of segregationists and white supremacists to send another political message, right? Like, Georgia puts that Confederate battle flag on its state flag in 1955. 1 year after Brown versus Board of Education, the Supreme Court case says segregation is illegal, right? Wow. So all of these states are like, are taking these symbols and making it do political work for them at that particular moment. So for me, this debate is not just about the Civil War, it's about times after it, when it's so obvious that this is about race, and not just about race, but racial exploitation and white supremacy, right? So for me, that reason is simple, that those statues have to go. I'm not saying you have to destroy them. You could move them to a museum, right, where you put a lot of context and plaques all around that help you understand why did they come up at that moment. But to keep them there in place as is without context, to me, that's kind of reinforcing the messages that they were meant to send in 1905, right? And we do not want to send those messages.
Right. But it's at the same time, it's important to tell those stories and not forget the stories of evil and bad things that were done, so we can remember not to do them in the future.
Right. I mean, think about it. There's so many figures in American history who are deeply complicated.
Yeah.
Woodrow Wilson, for example, right, who's president in the World War I era. He's a white Southern racist. There's no denying it. Like, he was a fan of the Ku Klux Klan. I mean, he never joined or anything. But he looked positively upon, their work, who believed that Reconstruction was this great mistake, that black people didn't deserve political power. Woodrow Wilson is the guy who, like, formally segregates Washington, D.C., like, brings Jim Crow to D.C., to the federal government. But then he's also, like, a guy who does a lot of good things too. I mean, he's like a major, part of the Democratic Party in the 20th century. He is a guy who, helps defeat Germany in World War I, wants to put into place this like international system, the League of Nations, that was going to like end warfare. Like, he does some positive things.
Right.
How do we deal with him? Do we just cancel him completely? No, I don't think that's possible, Same with Thomas Jefferson, who's kind of the founder. Well, that's a whole other conversation. But like, I just think we need to have open conversations about the nasty stuff, and then also acknowledge that, people are also capable of doing positive things that ripple out to us today.
Yeah, definitely. And like this is like, I can't stop thinking about what I was thinking about before we started this podcast was like, and again, just to clarify, this is not a very well-formed thought, but the first thing that came to mind when I started reading this stuff is that like today, even though racism has gotten a lot better compared to what it was in the Civil War era, it's still like a super hot, explosive topic in today's culture. And there's nothing you can say about somebody that is as bad as calling them a racist.
Right.
I guess is just so interesting to me is that the human race is just plagued with evil, atrocious sins that we've committed on each other throughout history. Yet those topics aren't as explosive as the topic of just racism in the last 200 years of America.
But none are equally powerful to the problem of race in the last 200 years of American history as it shapes our lives, right? I mean, yes, Greek pedophilia of 2,000 years ago is interesting and important in its own way, but our country was so profoundly shaped by the institution of slavery and by the imposition and the continued imposition of white supremacy as a legal system in the decades and century after that. I mean, I get that people feel like, oh, it's an obsession, but it has to be so because we have to grapple with this on a daily basis. And you know what? Americans have always been grappling with this. And in my book,
it's like an epigenetic curse.
It's something that Americans have felt the need to talk about for a long time. It blows me away that like the best-selling book of the 1800s that was written during the 1800s was Uncle Tom's Cabin by Harriet Beecher Stowe, a book about slavery. Then the best-selling book of the 1900s written in that century is Gone with the Wind by Margaret Mitchell, which is also about slavery and race.
Huckleberry Finn.
Yeah, I mean, like, there's a lot of folks out there today who want Americans to talk less about racism, to talk less about slavery. And, there's forces out there, some of them which are in Florida, especially, given the leadership of the state, who want to have fewer conversations about that. But the reality is that these are fundamental to understanding American history, and that if we try to sweep them under the rug, we're never going to come to terms with them. So it's really essential that Americans continue to talk about race, but to do so in a more enlightened and welcoming and open manner than they have before, because they haven't really been talking about it for a long time.
Has it been taken out of the school curriculum or something?
Well, there's big battles over school education codes and everything.
What would the argument be against it? So are they saying that teaching the true history of America, like what really happened during the Civil War, is like not appropriate for kids?
Yeah, and that it makes people bitter, that it divides our society, that it makes people upset. Well,
interesting.
You have to get upset about this.
Yeah.
If we don't get upset about it, how can we reject the legacy of it, right? I mean, we live in a society that's haunted by these patterns, and we have to have an open conversation about how to eliminate them.
Their argument is that we shouldn't teach the truth about American history because we need to forget it?
I think some people would probably agree with that. I'm not one of them.
No, I don't,
right?
think, I don't think it's right to forget about history.
As a historian, you have to teach the good, the bad, and the ugly, right? I mean, that means including the good too, right? There's good in many of these periods that we can find. But to make ourselves feel content and sort of pat ourselves on the back in order to erase and submerge histories is a really dangerous thing to do.
Yeah,
I really believe that.
Is this is something that I'm super unfamiliar with and haven't been paying attention to, but the critical race theory idea. Which side of that argument is the critical race? Is that critical race theory? Are they saying that you need to teach the truth about history, or are they saying that we should forget about history?
Here's the thing. critical race theory is this legal studies field that's super niche that I will be honest, I never even heard of until about 6 or 7 years ago. So it's not something that's like dominating the academy.
Okay.
What it's become is a boogeyman for conservatives to say, oh, here's this catchy phrase that most of them probably don't even understand because they don't read this stuff.
Do we know the definition of it?
I mean, if you work in this particular field, which is not all that many people, then, you know, they're interested in... Look, I'm a historian. I don't work in critical race theory by any means. But what I do is I study American history, right? And that in which race plays a really important and an influential role. So, well, basically, it's been this catchphrase that people have leapt onto to say, you know, oh, there's this campaign, you know, to make white people feel bad about U.S. history. And
to make white people feel bad about
that's
US
how it's
history.
used in conservative circles, you know, in kind of political rhetoric or so. It's not actually something that very many high school or even college teachers are actively doing. Some are, to be sure. And those people who are doing that, you know, they're, you know, you were wondering what sides they would be on, right? They'd be pushing, not just for telling the true history, but for looking at things like, you know, subconscious racism, microaggressions, various ways that, you know, racism reproduces itself in less obvious ways, right? So people in that field work on that. But it's really not what I'm doing. It's not what most historians are doing. But basically, I think a lot of folks on the right in the U.S. have swooped down on this kind of very, very small subfield and argued that, oh, well, this is what every high school teacher and every college instructor is doing, when this is really not actually the case. However, we historians do place race as a central and powerful actor and factor in American history, and it's impossible to teach it without doing that.
Yeah.
Right? Does that mean we're doing critical race theory? No. But it means that we're having hard and open conversations about race in the past, which is really necessary. And thankfully, Red Dead Redemption 2, the video game, can prove an important sort of window to open and have those conversations and debates. And that's a lot of what my book tries to do.